They had stopped celebrating births long before anyone dared to say why. In candlelit chambers, heavy with incense and fear, courtiers spoke in careful whispers, watching the cradle as if it carried both hope and doom. Each new child arrived wrapped not only in silk, but in expectation, and a quiet, unspoken dread. By the late 17th century, in the great courts of Madrid and Vienna, portraits lined the palace walls like silent witnesses. Generations of rulers stared down with familiar faces, familiar gins, familiar eyes. Too familiar. What had once been a strategy for survival had become something else entirely. Something fragile, something irreversible. The empire still glittered. Gold still flowed from distant colonies. Processions still marched through cathedral squares beneath banners of absolute power. Yet behind the velvet curtains, the future of a dynasty rested on a single figure whose very existence revealed the cost of centuries of ambition. A crown had been placed upon a head that could barely bear its weight. A life had been shaped before it began, not by choice, but by blood. Servants moved quietly. Advisors spoke in coded phrases. Physicians offered remedies they did not believe in. Everyone sensed what could not yet be spoken aloud. If this fragile thread snapped, an empire built over centuries might unravel in a generation. Because the fall of one of Europe's greatest ruling houses did not begin with war. It began with a family that married too well for far too long. Welcome to Dynasty Estates Chronicles, where we uncover the captivating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world's most powerful families. Here, grand palaces and glittering fortunes hide rivalries, sacrifices, and the human costs of legacy. If you enjoy immersive historical storytelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss a story. Join us as we explore the dynasties that shaped history and the price they paid to endure. Long before they ruled half of Europe, before their banners hung in cathedrals and their portraits filled gilded halls, the family that would become the Habsburgs lived far from the centers of power. Their beginnings lay among the rugged hills and river valleys of what is now northern Switzerland, in a landscape shaped by cold winters, stubborn soil, and the constant need for vigilance. Power, at first, was not inherited by them in abundance. It was pursued carefully, step by step, across generations that learned to survive before they learned to dominate. The name itself came from a fortress, Habsburg or Hawk's Castle, built in the 10th century on a hill above the Ari River. From this stronghold, the early counts watched over modest lands and trade routes. They were not kings. They were not even among the most influential nobles of their age. They were one of many minor families competing for influence in a fragmented Holy Roman Empire, where loyalties shifted as easily as borders and authority depended as much on alliances as on arms. In those early centuries, survival demanded patience and calculation. The empire in which they lived was a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, each with its own ambitions. To rise in such an environment required more than military strength. It required endurance, opportunism, and an understanding that power could be gained quietly as well as violently. The Habsburgs learned to watch, to wait, and to act only when the moment favored them. Their fortunes began to change in the 13th century with the rise of Rudolf of Habsburg, born in 1218. Unlike many nobles of his time, Rudolf possessed not only ambition but a careful sense of timing. He expanded the family's influence through land purchases, alliances, and strategic support for the right factions within imperial politics. When the Holy Roman Empire found itself without a strong ruler in 1273, the princes of the realm sought a candidate who was powerful enough to lead, but not so powerful as to threaten their own autonomy. Rudolf, seen as capable, yet manageable, was elected king of the Romans. The election marked a turning point. Suddenly, a family that had once been provincial counts found itself at the center of imperial authority. Yet the crown did not guarantee stability. Rudolf's position had to be defended and secured. One of his greatest challenges came from Ottokar II of Bohemia, a rival whose lands and influence threatened to overshadow the Habsburg claim. Their conflict culminated in the Battle of Marchfeld in 1278, where Rudolf's forces defeated Ottokar and secured control over Austria and Styria. This victory proved decisive, Control of Austria gave the Habsburgs a territorial base, far richer and more strategically valuable than their original holdings. Vienna, in time, would become their political and cultural center. From these lands, they began to build a more permanent presence in European affairs. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, from regional lords to a dynasty with imperial ambitions. Yet even in these early successes, patterns began to form that would define the family for centuries. They did not rely solely on conquest. Instead, they developed a reputation for securing power through marriage alliances. By marrying into other noble families, they extended their influence without always resorting to war. Over time, this approach became a guiding principle, later captured in a phrase often associated with their strategy: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." At first, this method seemed both practical and brilliant. Marriage created alliances, brought new territories under their control, and reduced the need for costly battles. It allowed them to weave themselves into the fabric of European nobility, connecting their bloodline to multiple thrones. Each union strengthened their position, ensuring that even when military power fluctuated, their influence endured through family ties. But such strategies carried hidden risks. As alliances grew more intricate, the circle of potential spouses narrowed. Marriages were arranged not for affection or compatibility, but for consolidation of power. Cousins married cousins. Uncles arranged unions for nieces with an eye towards land and titles, rather than personal well-being. At first, these decisions seemed logical within the framework of dynastic politics. Few could have predicted the long-term consequences. The early Habsburg generations could not yet see the shadow forming behind their success. They saw expansion, recognition, and legitimacy. They saw a future in which their descendants would sit on multiple thrones and shape the fate of continents. What they did not see, or perhaps chose not to consider, was how the very strategy that ensured their rise might one day place limits on their survival. For now, their story was one of ascent. Their lands grew, their influence spread. Their name, once tied to a single castle on a Swiss hill, began to echo in courts and councils across Europe. They had secured a foothold in imperial politics and laid the foundations for something far larger than themselves. The dynasty that would one day rule vast territories had begun as a modest house with careful ambitions and a willingness to wait for the right moment. Yet within that patience lay the seeds of a future cost. The pursuit of continuity through blood would one day test the very strength it was meant to preserve. The Habsburgs were rising, and with each calculated step upward, they moved closer to a destiny shaped not only by ambition and strategy, but by the choices they made about family, legacy, and the meaning of power itself. By the 15th century, the Habsburgs had moved far beyond their modest Alpine beginnings. Their lands in Austria gave them stability, and their growing reputation in imperial politics offered opportunity. Yet they were not the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Not yet. Their true ascent would come not through sweeping military conquest, but through a series of decisions so deliberate and so patient that their consequences would shape the entire continent for centuries. At the center of this transformation stood Maximilian I, born in 1459. Unlike many rulers who relied primarily on armies, Maximilian understood that the future of his house depended on alliances that would outlast battles. His reign would mark a turning point, not only for the Habsburgs, but for the structure of European power itself. He saw clearly that territory gained through marriage could be more secure than territory gained through war. Marriage, when arranged carefully, created bonds that were difficult to undo without destabilizing entire regions. In 1477, Maximilian married Mary of Burgundy, the only child and heiress of Charles the Bold. This union brought the wealthy Burgundian Netherlands under Habsburg influence, lands rich in trade, culture, and political importance. The marriage was not merely romantic or ceremonial. It was strategic. It placed the Habsburgs at the crossroads of European commerce and diplomacy. Suddenly, they possessed not only Austrian lands, but also access to some of the most prosperous territories in Western Europe. Yet even this was only the beginning. Maximilian arranged the marriage of his son, Philip, later known as Philip de Huntsum, to Joanna of Castile in 1496. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the powerful monarchs who had unified their kingdoms and sponsored voyages across the Atlantic. These marae, like Maximilian's own, was carefully calculated. At the time, few could have predicted how completely it would reshape the Habsburg destiny. Through a series of deaths and inheritances, Philip and Joanna's son, Charles, would come to inherit an extraordinary collection of territories. Born in 1500, Charles grew up surrounded by the expectations of multiple realms. By the time he reached adulthood, he held Spain and its expanding overseas empire, the Burgundian Netherlands, Austrian lands, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. When Charles V assumed full power in the early 16th century, he governed territories so vast that observers later remarked that the sun never set on his domains. The scale of Habsburg influence under Charles V was unprecedented. Spain brought wealth from the Americas, including silver and gold that flowed into European markets. The Holy Roman Empire provided prestige and authority across Central Europe. Italian territories added cultural and strategic value. Through inheritance rather than conquest alone, the Habsburgs found themselves at the center of European politics, diplomacy, and religion. Yet such power came with immense strain. Charles V spent much of his reign traveling between his territories, attempting to maintain unity across regions with different languages, laws, and loyalties. He faced challenges from the Ottoman Empire in the east, from Protestant reformers within the empire, and from rival monarchs, particularly in France, who feared Habsburg dominance. Even at the height of their power, the dynasty's position was not secure. It required constant negotiation, constant vigilanza, and constant reinforcement through alliances. One of the most significant choices Charles made was to divide his inheritance. In 1556, recognizing the difficulty of ruling such vast territories as a single entity, he split the Habsburg holdings into two branches. His brother Ferdinand received the Austrian lands and the imperial title, while his son Philip II inherited Spain, the Netherlands, and overseas territories. This division created the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg lines, each powerful in its own right, but linked by blood and shared interest. For a time, the arrangement seemed effective. Both branches maintained influence across Europe, often cooperating in matters of religion and politics. Philip II of Spain presided over an empire enriched by colonial wealth, while the Austrian branch continued to dominate Central European affairs. Their courts became centers of culture, ceremony, and authority. Monarchs from other regions sought alliances with them, recognizing that connection to the Habsburg name brought legitimacy and protection. Yet beneath this expansion lay a growing reliance on dynastic marriage to maintain cohesion between the branches. Royal unions increasingly occurred within a limited circle of relatives. Cousins married cousins. Uncles arranged marriages for nieces. These decisions were seen as practical, ensuring that territories remained within the family and that influence did not pass into rival hands. In the short term, such strategies preserved unity and prevented fragmentation. In the long term, they narrowed the family's genetic diversity and placed increasing pressure on each generation to produce healthy heirs. At court, success was measured by continuity. An heir meant stability. A marriage alliance meant security. But these expectations also created personal burdens. Individuals within the dynasty often had little say in their own futures. Marriages were arranged for political gain rather than affection. Children were raised not merely as sons and daughters, but as future rulers, symbols of continuity rather than individuals with independent desires. The human cost of these arrangements was rarely discussed openly. Duty overshadowed personal happiness, and loyalty to the dynasty came before all else. Even in moments of triumph, signs of strain appeared. The empire's vastness made governance difficult. Conflicts with rival powers drained resources. Religious divisions within Europe created internal tensions. And within the family itself, the practice of close-kin marriages began to leave subtle marks on successive generations. At first, these were dismissed as minor or coincidental. Few could have imagined that they would one day become central to the dynasty's decline. For now, however, the Habsburgs stood at the height of their influence. Through calculated decisions and strategic unions, they had transformed themselves from regional nobles into rulers of a transcontinental empire. Their success seemed to confirm the wisdom of their methods. Marriage had proven more effective than war in many cases. Alliances had secured lands that armies might have struggled to hold. The dynasty appeared unassailable. Yet with each carefully arranged union, they moved further along a path that would become increasingly difficult to reverse. Power gained through blood ties demanded that those ties be preserved at all costs, and as the circle of suitable partners grew smaller, the burden on each generation grew heavier. The Habsburgs had mastered the art of dynastic expansion. What they had not yet fully reckoned with was the price that such mastery might eventually demand. By the middle of the 16th century, the Habsburgs had achieved what few dynasties in European history ever managed: influence that stretched across kingdoms, cultures, and continents. Their banners flew over cities in Spain, Austria, Italy, the Low Countries, and beyond. Their relatives sat on multiple thrones. Their decisions shaped the balance of power across Europe. Yet the very size of their dominion created pressures that would test not only their political strength but their sense of identity as a ruling family. After the reign of Charles V, the division of Habsburg territories into Spanish and Austrian branches created two centers of authority bound by shared blood and mutual interest. In Spain, Philip II ruled from the vast palace monastery of El Escorial, a symbol of royal discipline and religious devotion. In Austria, the imperial court in Vienna grew into a center of diplomacy and culture. Though separated by geography, the two branches maintained close ties, often cooperating in religious and political matters. Their shared Catholic faith and dynastic ambitions aligned them against common rivals, particularly Protestant states and the expanding influence of France. This period saw the Habsburgs reach the height of their authority. Spanish fleets crossed the Atlantic, bringing wealth from the Americas that funded wars in courtly splendor. Austrian rulers expanded their influence into Central and Eastern Europe, securing territories in Bohemia and Hungary. The dynasty appeared to embody continuity itself, a family whose reach extended across borders and whose legitimacy seemed rooted in divine favor. Yet the maintenance of such a vast network required careful coordination. Communication across distant territories was slow. Regional differences in law, language, and culture demanded constant negotiation. Rulers relied on councils, ambassadors, and relatives to maintain order. At times, the distance between branches created tension. Decisions made in Madrid affected Vienna, and actions taken in Vienna reverberated in Madrid. Despite these challenges, the dynasty persisted, guided by a shared commitment to preserving its influence. Marriage remained central to this strategy. Alliances with other royal houses strengthened their position, but increasingly, marriages occurred within the extended family itself. Such unions were intended to prevent rival dynasties from gaining influence over Habsburg territories. By keeping power within the family, they believed they could maintain stability. Over time, however, the circle of suitable partners grew smaller. The practice of marrying close relatives became more frequent, seen not as unusual but as necessary. The courts of Madrid and Vienna reflected the grandeur of Habsburg rule. Ceremonies emphasized continuity and divine authority. Portraits depicted rulers with distinctive features that became associated with the dynasty: strong jaws, pale complexions, and solemn expressions. Palaces filled with art, music, and elaborate rituals reinforced the image of an unbroken lineage chosen to govern. Visitors to these courts witnessed splendor and order, rarely glimpsing the private anxieties that lay beneath. Externally, the Habsburgs faced constant challenges. Protestant reform movements spread across Europe, challenging Catholic dominance and creating divisions within the Holy Roman Empire. The Ottoman Empire pressed against Habsburg territories in Hungary and beyond, leading to prolonged military conflicts. France, under powerful monarchs such as Henry IV and later Louis XIII and Louis XIV, sought to limit Habsburg influence and expand its own. These pressures required the dynasty to remain vigilant and adaptable. One of the most defining conflicts of this era was the 30 Years' War, which began in 1618. Though sparked by religious tensions within the Holy Roman Empire, it quickly became a broader struggle involving multiple European powers. The Austrian Habsburgs fought to maintain Catholic authority and imperial control, while Protestant states and foreign powers resisted. The war devastated large parts of Central Europe, leading to widespread destruction and loss of life. When it ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, the Habsburgs retained significant influence, but faced a changed political landscape. The authority of the Holy Roman Emperor was reduced, and the balance of power shifted among European states. Despite these setbacks, the dynasty continued to project strength. Their courts remained symbols of stability. Their marriages continued to link them with other ruling families. Their territories, though challenged, remained extensive. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, subtle signs of strain emerged within the family itself. The reliance on closely related marriages began to produce heirs who were physically fragile or struggled with health issues. At first, these cases were viewed as isolated or unfortunate. The broader implications were not fully acknowledged. In Spain, the later generations of the Habsburg line displayed increasing signs of decline. Heirs were fewer, and concerns about succession grew. Advisors and courtiers began to worry privately about the future. In Austria, the situation was somewhat more stable, but the same dynastic patterns persisted. The need to maintain control over vast territories meant that suitable marriage partners were often drawn from within the same limited pool of relatives. Each generation faced the expectation of producing heirs who could sustain the dynasty's authority. Socially, the Habsburgs had secured their place among Europe's elite. Their name carried prestige and recognition. Monarchs sought alliances with them, and their approval could influence political outcomes across the continent. Yet belonging to such an elevated position came with isolation. Members of the dynasty lived within carefully controlled environments, surrounded by protocol and expectation. Personal desires were often secondary to political necessity. Marriages were arranged, careers predetermined, and lives shaped by the demands of maintaining power. As the 17th century progressed, the dynasty stood at a crossroads. They remained one of Europe's most influential families, with territories and alliances that stretched across regions. Their strategy of expansion through marriage had succeeded beyond what earlier generations could have imagined. Yet the same strategy now required careful management to prevent internal weakening. The preservation of authority demanded continuity, and continuity depended on heirs. Each birth became a matter of political importance. Each marriage was scrutinized for its potential impact on the family's future. To observers, the Habsburgs still appeared formidable. Their ceremonies were grand, their courts disciplined, and their influence undeniable. Few outside the inner circles fully grasped the extent to which the dynasty relied on maintaining its bloodline through increasingly limited options. The very method that had secured their rise now demanded ever greater sacrifice from those born into the family. The expansion of Habsburg power across Europe represented one of the most remarkable dynastic achievements of the early modern period. Through calculated decisions, strategic alliances, and persistent ambition, they had established themselves as central figures in European affairs. Their authority extended across borders, and their name carried weight in every major court. Yet, with each generation, the cost of sustaining such dominance grew heavier. The dynasty's future depended not only on political skill but on the health and stability of its heirs. For the moment, the Habsburgs still stood at the height of their influence. Their territories remained vast, their alliances strong, and their reputation formidable. But within the private chambers of their palaces, concerns about succession and continuity began to take on a more urgent tone. The strategy that had once ensured their expansion now required them to confront the limits of their own methods. The empire they had built through marriage and inheritance seemed secure, yet the foundations beneath it were becoming more fragile than anyone dared to admit aloud. The Habsburgs had achieved a level of power that few families in history could rival. They had entered the highest circles of European society and reshaped the political landscape through careful planning and relentless ambition. Yet even as they celebrated their achievements, the seeds of a future crisis were already present, woven quietly into the very bloodline that had carried them to such extraordinary heights. By the late 17th century, Europe was no longer shaped by a single dominant dynasty. Instead, it had become a stage where powerful houses watched one another carefully, measuring influence through territory, marriage, and reputation. Among them, the Habsburgs remained formidable, yet their authority no longer went unchallenged. Across the continent, in the glittering court of Versailles, another dynasty was rising, one that believed power should not be shared. The tension between the Habsburgs and the Bourbon monarchy of France did not begin with a single battle. It began with perception. Both families saw themselves as natural leaders of Europe, guardians of order and legitimacy. Both believed their rule carried a sense of inevitability, yet their visions for the continent could not easily coexist. Where the Habsburgs relied on inherited networks of alliance and tradition, the Bourbons projected centralized strength, theatrical authority, and an unambiguous claim to dominance. The personal dimension of this rivalry emerged through the figures of Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Louis XIV of France. Though they rarely met face-to-face in informal settings, their courts observed each other constantly through ambassadors, envoys, and carefully staged ceremonies. Reports traveled between Vienna and Versailles describing court rituals, alliances, and shifts in influence. Every marriage proposal, every diplomatic gesture, and every territorial claim carried meaning. Louis XIV cultivated an image of absolute monarchy, presenting himself as the embodiment of the state. His court at Versailles became a symbol of cultural and political power, drawing nobles into a carefully controlled environment where loyalty to the crown was reinforced daily. Leopold I, ruling from Vienna, maintained a more traditional imperial authority rooted in the structures of the Holy Roman Empire. His power depended on alliances among princes, bishops, and nobles across Central Europe. Where Louis projected unity and spectacle, Leopold navigated complexity and negotiation. Their rivalry intensified through territorial disputes in regions such as the Spanish, Netherlands, and parts of Italy. These lands held strategic importance, and control over them influenced trade routes, military access, and political prestige. Each dynasty sought to strengthen its position without provoking a conflict so large that it would destabilize the entire continent. Diplomacy became a form of competition. Treaties were proposed, alliances shifted, and marriages were arranged with careful calculation. At the heart of this growing tension lay a deeper concern. Succession. The Spanish branch of the Habsburg family, once the most powerful, was weakening. Its king, Charles II of Spain, suffered from severe health issues and lacked an heir for both the Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs. The question of who would inherit Spain's vast territories became increasingly urgent. Spain's empire still included lands in Europe and the Americas, and whoever controlled its crown would hold immense influence. Initial discussions about succession were cautious. Envoys exchanged proposals suggesting partitions of Spanish territories to avoid conflict. Yet beneath the surface, neither side truly trusted the other. Each feared that the other might gain too much. Each believed its own claims stronger. The courts of Europe watched closely, aware that the death of a single monarch could ignite a wider struggle. This period marked the beginning of a rivalry that would shape European politics for decades. It was not simply a contest between two rulers, but between two visions of power. The Habsburgs represented continuity through dynastic networks and inherited legitimacy. The Bourbons represented centralized authority and expanding ambition. Their differences created tension, not only in diplomacy but in identity. Each dynasty defined itself, partly in opposition to the other. For the Habsburgs, the stakes were deeply personal. Their claim to Spain rested on family ties and long-standing inheritance. Losing Spain would mean losing a central pillar of their influence. For the Bourbons, gaining Spain would extend their reach and confirm their status as Europe's leading power. The question was no longer whether rivalry existed. It was how far it would go and what it would cost. As negotiations continued and suspicions deepened, the relationship between the two houses shifted from cautious competition to something more entrenched. The possibility of compromise grew slimmer. Beneath the formal language of diplomacy lay a growing sense that Europe stood on the edge of a transformation. The fate of one weakening king would soon determine whether balance could be preserved, or whether a struggle for dominance would reshape the continent entirely. As the 17th century drew towards its close, the rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbon monarchy of France deepened from quiet suspicion into something far more dangerous. Diplomacy still existed, and ambassadors still spoke in careful phrases. But beneath the formal language lay a growing certainty that the balance of power in Europe could not hold forever. Too much depended on a single question: who would inherit the Spanish throne when its fragile king finally died? Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, embodied the consequences of generations of dynastic strategy. From infancy, his health was a matter of concern. He struggled to speak clearly, to walk steadily, and to rule effectively. Courtiers whispered about his weakness in guarded corridors. Physicians attempted treatments with little success. Advisors worried not only about the present, but about the future. Charles had no children, and the chances of him producing an heir grew slimmer with each passing year. To the Habsburgs, Charles represented continuity. Spain had been part of their dynastic network for generations. Losing it would weaken their position across Europe and diminish the authority they had built over centuries. To the Bourbons, however, the approaching vacancy on the Spanish throne represented opportunity. If a Bourbon prince could inherit Spain, France's influence would expand dramatically, potentially uniting two powerful realms under closely related rulers. At first, both sides attempted to manage the situation through negotiation. Secret treaties proposed dividing Spanish territories among various claimants in order to prevent a single dynasty from becoming too dominant. Such agreements were fragile and often short-lived. Each side feared that the other might ignore the terms once the Spanish king died. Trust was limited, and the stakes were too high for either dynasty to rely entirely on promises. Within the Spanish court itself, factions formed. Some advisors favored an Austrian Habsburg successor, hoping to maintain continuity with the past. Others supported a Bourbon candidate, believing that France's strength might offer stability. Charles II, aware of his own limitations, struggled to decide whom to trust. He lived under constant pressure from foreign ambassadors, each seeking to influence his will. The personal burden on him was immense. His life had become a matter of international importance, yet he had little control over the forces surrounding him. Meanwhile, the courts of Vienna and Versailles prepared for multiple outcomes. Military leaders reviewed troop positions. Diplomats strengthened alliances with smaller states. Intelligence networks gathered information on potential shifts in loyalty. Every development in Madrid was reported with urgency. A minor illness in the Spanish king could trigger speculation across Europe. A rumor about a possible will could alter diplomatic calculations overnight. The rivalry also played out in public displays of prestige. Louis XIV continued to cultivate the splendor of Versailles, reinforcing the image of a powerful and unified monarchy. His court became a center of culture, attracting artists, musicians, and nobles eager to associate themselves with French influence. In contrast, the Habsburg court in Vienna emphasized tradition, ceremony, and continuity. Each dynasty projected confidence, yet both were aware that the coming succession crises could transform their fortunes dramatically. As Charles II's health declined further in the 1690s, tension escalated. The possibility of compromise grew increasingly remote. Advisors on both sides began to prepare for conflict. European states aligned themselves with one faction or another, anticipating that the death of the Spanish king might lead to war. The Dutch Republic, England, and various German states watched carefully, determined to prevent any single dynasty from gaining overwhelming dominance. The personal cost of this escalating tension was profound. Members of the Habsburg family found themselves defined by their political roles rather than their personal relationships. Marriages were arranged, not for affection, but for strategic advantage. Individuals became symbols of dynastic ambition. The pressure to produce heirs, to maintain alliances, and to defend claims weighed heavily on each generation. Even those not directly involved in decision-making felt the strain of expectations. Within Spain, the atmosphere grew increasingly anxious. Charles II's court operated under a cloud of uncertainty. Every decision he made was scrutinized for its potential impact on the succession. Advisors debated in private chambers, aware that their recommendations could shape the future of Europe. The king himself lived with the knowledge that his death would trigger a crisis far beyond his own kingdom. His personal struggles were inseparable from the political fate of the continent. By the end of the century, it was clear that the rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons had moved beyond diplomacy into preparation for confrontation. Alliances were formalized. Military resources were allocated. Plans were drawn up for the moment when the Spanish throne became vacant. Though open war had not yet begun, the atmosphere across Europe felt increasingly tense, as if the continent were holding its breath. The rivalry had also begun to reshape identities within the Habsburg dynasty. Their sense of legitimacy rested on inheritance and tradition. To lose Spain would be more than a political setback. It would be a blow to their identity as Europe's leading house. For the Bourbons, gaining Spain would confirm their ascendancy and redefine the balance of power. Each dynasty saw the coming succession not merely as a territorial question, but as a test of its place in history. As the final years of Charles II's life approached, the stage was set for a transformation that could not easily be reversed. Negotiations had failed to resolve the issue. Trust between rival courts had eroded, Alliances had hardened. What remained uncertain was not whether change would come, but how sudden and how severe it would be. The tension that filled European courts was no longer subtle. It shaped conversations, guided decisions, and influenced the futures of entire nations. A single death would soon determine whether diplomacy could preserve balance, or whether rivalry would erupt into a conflict capable of reshaping the map of Europe. For the Habsburgs, the stakes were deeply personal. For the Bourbons, they were equally profound. And for the continent as a whole, the approaching moment promised consequences that would echo for generations. By the closing years of the 17th century, the rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons was no longer confined to quiet diplomacy or private negotiations. It had become a contest of legitimacy, reputation, and perception. Across Europe, courts watched closely, not only to see who would inherit Spain, but to determine which dynasty truly deserved to dominate the continent. Power was measured not just in armies and territory, but in acceptance, in the recognition of authority by other rulers, nobles, and institutions. For the Habsburgs, legitimacy rested on continuity. They had ruled Spain and vast parts of Europe for generations. Their claim to the Spanish throne was rooted in bloodline and tradition. To them, the idea that Spain might pass to a Bourbon prince felt like a disruption of the natural order. Their identity as Europe's foremost dynasty depended on maintaining that inheritance. Losing Spain would not simply reduce their territories. It would weaken their standing among Europe's ruling houses and challenge the narrative of their enduring authority. The Bourbons, however, presented a different vision of power. Under Louis XIV, France projected confidence, wealth, and centralized strength. Versailles became a stage upon which the king displayed not only his authority but the cultural superiority of his court. Nobles from across Europe admired the order and splendor of French ceremony. Diplomats observed carefully orchestrated rituals designed to reinforce the image of an unchallenged monarch. By placing a Bourbon on the Spanish throne, France would extend this model of centralized authority beyond its borders, reshaping the balance of influence in Europe. The struggle for Spain's succession thus became a battle for recognition. Each dynasty sought the support of other states, knowing that acceptance by allies could determine the outcome. England, the Dutch Republic, and various German principalities weighed their options cautiously. None wished to see Europe dominated by a single power. Alliances formed not solely out of loyalty but out of concern for balance. The Habsburgs emphasized continuity and stability. The Bourbons emphasized strength and renewal. Both argued that their claim offered the best future for Spain and for Europe as a whole. Within Spain itself, the issue of acceptance carried profound emotional weight. King Charles II lived under the constant awareness that his death would determine the fate of his kingdom. His court was divided. Some advisors supported an Austrian Habsburg successor, believing that maintaining dynastic continuity would preserve Spain's identity. Others favored a Bourbon candidate, hoping that France's strength might stabilize a declining empire. Charles's own sense of identity was shaped by these competing pressures. His role as king was overshadowed by the knowledge that his reign might mark the end of a lineage that had defined Spain for generations. The personal toll on Charles was immense. He had been raised as the embodiment of dynastic continuity, yet he could not provide an heir. His physical and mental struggles became symbols of the dynasty's fragility. Foreign ambassadors observed him carefully, reporting on his health and behavior. Each sign of weakness intensified speculation about succession. His court became a place of cautious maneuvering, where every decision carried implications far beyond Spain's borders. At the same time, members of the Habsburg family in Vienna faced their own pressures. They were expected to defend their claim to Spain while maintaining alliances across the Holy Roman Empire. Their identity as rulers depended on being recognized as legitimate heirs. Losing Spain would not only reduce their territories, but alter their standing among Europe's monarchies. The rivalry with France thus became deeply personal. It was no longer simply a matter of politics. It was a matter of identity and legacy. Public perception played a crucial role. Pamphlets, letters, and diplomatic reports circulated across Europe, shaping opinions about the competing claims. Supporters of the Habsburgs emphasized tradition and continuity. They argued that Spain should remain under the same dynastic umbrella that had governed it for generations. Supporters of the Bourbons highlighted France's strength and stability, suggesting that a Bourbon ruler could revitalize Spain's declining fortunes. Each narrative sought to win not only political support but moral justification. In the courts of Europe, Ceremonies and gestures became tools of rivalry. Invitations to royal weddings, baptisms, and diplomatic events were carefully considered. Seating arrangements at banquets could signal favor or disapproval. Titles and honors were granted or withheld. To influence perception, every detail contributed to the broader struggle for status. To be recognized as the rightful heir to Spain meant securing not only legal claims, but social acceptance among Europe's elites. The rivalry also affected individuals within the dynasties. Marriages were arranged with even greater caution, ensuring that alliances supported political objectives. Personal relationships became secondary to strategic needs. Princes and princesses were raised with the understanding that their lives would serve the dynasty's ambitions. The pressure to maintain unity and legitimacy weighed heavily on them. Even those far from the center of decision-making felt the impact of expectations shaped by the looming succession crises. For the Habsburgs, the rivalry with France created a sense of urgency. Their identity had long been tied to the idea of a united dynastic network spanning multiple kingdoms. The potential loss of Spain threatened that vision. It also forced them to confront the limits of their strategy. Their reliance on closely related marriages had preserved territories within the family, but it had also narrowed their options. The absence of a strong heir in Spain exposed vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. The Bourbons, meanwhile, sought opportunity. By placing a French prince on the Spanish throne, they could extend their influence and reshape Europe's political landscape. Yet even they faced risks. Other powers feared that a union between France and Spain might create an overwhelming superpower. To gain acceptance, the Bourbons had to reassure other states that balance would be maintained. Diplomacy and image management became as important as military preparation. As Charles II's health continued to decline, the struggle for status intensified. His eventual will would determine not only the fate of Spain, but the balance of power across Europe. Advisors from competing factions sought to influence him, each presenting arguments for why their preferred candidate should inherit the throne. The king himself, aware of his role and shape in history, faced immense pressure. His decision would affect millions, yet his own life remained constrained by the expectations placed upon him since birth. The rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons thus moved beyond territory into the realm of identity and perception. Each dynasty sought recognition as the rightful leader of Europe. Each believed its claim represented stability and legitimacy. Yet beneath these public narratives lay deeper anxieties. For the Habsburgs, the potential loss of Spain threatened to undermine centuries of carefully constructed influence. For the Bourbons, the pursuit of Spain carried the risk of provoking a coalition determined to prevent their dominance. Internally, the rivalry caused lasting damage. Relationships within the Habsburg family grew strained under the pressure to secure their claim. The expectation that every member must serve the dynasty's interests left little room for personal choice. The sense of identity that had once unified them now carried the weight of uncertainty. Could they remain Europe's foremost dynasty without Spain? Could they preserve their legacy if their network of alliances began to unravel? For Charles II, the conflict shaped his final years. His life became a symbol of a dynasty's decline and a continent's uncertainty. Surrounded by advisors and diplomats, he lived with the knowledge that his death would trigger a transformation he could not control. The burden of representing a fading line weighed heavily on him. His personal struggles mirrored the broader fragility of the system he embodied. By the time the end of the century approached, the battle for status had reached its peak. Alliances were solidified. Arguments were rehearsed. Plans were prepared for the moment when the Spanish throne would become vacant. The rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons had reshaped European politics and identities alike. It had turned questions of inheritance into questions of legitimacy and belonging. It had forced dynasties to define themselves not only by what they ruled, but by how they were recognized. The death of Charles II would soon determine the outcome of this struggle. Yet regardless of who inherited Spain, the rivalry had already left its mark. It had altered relationships, deepened divisions, and revealed the human cost of dynastic ambition. The quest for acceptance and status had pushed families and nations towards a confrontation that would change Europe forever. What remained uncertain was whether any victory could fully repair the internal damage already done, or whether the cost of recognition would prove far greater than anyone had anticipated. By the year 1700, the tension that had hovered over Europe for decades settled into a quiet, unmistakable certainty. The death of one frail king would decide the fate of empires. Courts across the continent prepared not for celebration, but for upheaval. Behind palace walls, ministers drafted letters, generals reviewed maps, and monarchs weighed alliances that could either preserve balance or ignite a war. Unlike any Europe had seen in a generation, Charles II of Spain, long plagued by illness and unable to produce an heir, now lived under constant observation. His declining health was reported daily to foreign courts. Every rumor traveled swiftly between Madrid, Vienna, Versailles, London, and The Hague. Though still alive, he had already become the center of a political storm. The question was no longer if he would die without an heir, but what would follow when he did. Two primary claims stood ready. The Austrian Habsburgs believed Spain should remain within their extended family, maintaining continuity with the past. They supported Archduke Charles, a younger member of their line, as the rightful successor. The Bourbons, led by Louis XIV of France, argued for Philip of Anjou, the king's grandson. To them, placing a Bourbon on the Spanish throne would secure stability and strengthen ties between France and Spain. At first, Europe attempted to avoid war through negotiation. Secret treaties were proposed to divide Spanish territories among various powers. The idea was simple. If no single dynasty inherited everything, balance could be preserved. Yet these agreements required trust, and trust was in short supply. Each side suspected the other of planning to ignore any treaty once the Spanish king died. Diplomacy began to feel like a fragile bridge stretched over deep uncertainty. As Charles II's condition worsened, pressure mounted within his court. Advisors urged him to name a single heir to avoid fragmentation of the empire. The choice carried enormous consequences. If he selected an Austrian Habsburg, France might challenge the decision. If he chose a Bourbon, Austria would resist. Whatever he decided, conflict seemed increasingly likely. Beyond Spain, preparations quietly accelerated. England and the Dutch Republic feared the rise of a dominant Bourbon power, controlling both France and Spain. They began forming defensive alliances with the Austrian Habsburgs. Military commanders reviewed troop numbers and supply lines. Fortifications were inspected. Though no formal declarations had been made, Europe was already preparing for confrontation. In Versailles, Louis XIV projected confidence. He believed that placing his grandson on the Spanish throne would secure France's position and reshape the political landscape in his favor. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold I prepared to defend the Habsburg claim, viewing Spain as a crucial part of his dynasty's legacy. Both rulers framed their actions as efforts to preserve order, yet each knew that compromise was slipping away. When Charles II finally drafted his will, he chose Philip of Anjou as his heir, naming him Philip V of Spain. The decision aimed to preserve the unity of the Spanish Empire rather than divide it. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Europe might accept the outcome. Louis XIV publicly accepted the will, though his subsequent actions, including recognizing Philip's right to the French throne if circumstances allowed, alarmed other powers. The fear of a combined Bourbon superpower reignited tensions immediately. Alliances hardened. England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria moved closer together, determined to prevent France and Spain from uniting too closely. Military mobilization followed. Troops gathered along borders. Commanders prepared campaigns. What had once been a matter of succession had become a matter of survival for the European balance of power. The stage was now set. Diplomacy had reached its limits. A single death had triggered a chain of events that could not easily be reversed. For the Habsburgs, the coming conflict would determine whether they could maintain their status as Europe's leading dynasty. For the Bourbons, it would decide whether their influence could extend across the continent. For Europe, it meant that the struggle for succession would soon give way to war, a conflict born not from sudden anger, but from years of careful preparation, deep suspicion, and ambitions too vast to contain. When open war finally came in 1701, it did not begin with a single dramatic clash, but with a series of calculated moves across Europe. Armies mobilized along frontiers, alliances were formally declared, and commanders prepared campaigns that would stretch across continents. The War of the Spanish Succession was not simply a fight over who would rule Spain. It was a struggle over the balance of power in Europe, and every major dynasty understood that the outcome would shape the future of the continent for generations. The Austrian Habsburgs, supported by England, the Dutch Republic, and several German states opposed the Bourbon claim to Spain. They feared that if Philip V remained on the Spanish throne under the influence of Louis XIV, France would gain unprecedented control. For the Habsburgs, the war became a defense of both dynastic legitimacy and European equilibrium. For France and Bourbon Spain, it was a fight to preserve the will of Charles II and to assert their rightful inheritance. The early years of the conflict saw campaigns spread across multiple theaters. In the Low Countries, armies maneuvered for control of key fortresses and trade routes. In Italy, rival forces clashed over strategic territories. In Germany, imperial lands became battlegrounds as alliances shifted and local rulers chose sides. The scale of the war made it clear that this was not a brief conflict. It would require resources, endurance, and careful leadership. Among the most influential commanders on the Habsburg side was Prince Eugene of Savoy, whose military skill and determination made him a formidable opponent. Fighting alongside him in several campaigns was John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, representing England's interests. Together, they coordinated operations designed to weaken French influence and support the Austrian claimant, Archduke Charles. Their cooperation reflected the broader alliance formed to contain Bourbon power. One of the war's defining moments came in 1704 at the Battle of Blenheim. French and Bavarian forces had threatened Vienna, the heart of Habsburg authority. If the city fell, the Austrian position might collapse entirely. Marlborough and Prince Eugene led their armies across difficult terrain to confront the opposing forces. The battle was fierce and decisive. The Allied victory prevented a French advance into Austria and marked a turning point in the war. It demonstrated that the Bourbon alliance could be resisted and that the Habsburg cause remained viable. Subsequent battles reinforced this shift. At Ramillies, in 1706, Allied forces secured a significant victory in the Low Countries, weakening French control in the region. In Italy, Prince Eugene achieved successes that challenged Bourbon influence, yet the war remained costly and uncertain. Both sides experienced losses, and no single victory brought a definitive end to the conflict. Each campaign required new resources, new strategies, and renewed commitment from allies. The human cost of the war was immense. Soldiers marched across vast distances, often facing harsh conditions and uncertain supplies. Civilians in contested regions endured sieges, occupation, and economic disruption. Towns changed hands multiple times. Families were displaced. The conflict that began as a dynastic dispute had become a continental struggle affecting countless lives. Yet for the ruling houses at its center, the war remained tied to questions of legitimacy and survival. Within the Habsburg family, the war carried deep personal significance. Archduke Charles, the Austrian claimant to the Spanish throne, was proclaimed King Charles III by his supporters. He traveled to Spain and established a rival court in Barcelona, seeking to assert his authority. His presence turned Spain itself into a divided realm, with regions supporting different claimants. The war thus became not only an international conflict, but also a civil struggle within Spain. For Louis XIV, the war tested the limits of France's strength. Though his armies were formidable, the combined opposition of multiple powers strained resources. Economic pressures mounted. Public confidence wavered, yet he remained committed to defending his grandson's claim. To retreat would mean acknowledging defeat and weakening the Bourbon position. The war became a matter of honor as well as strategy. As the years passed, the conflict reached a stalemate. Victories on one front were offset by setbacks on another. Both alliances recognized that a decisive military triumph might be elusive. Diplomatic efforts resumed intermittently, though trust remained fragile. Each side sought terms that would preserve its interests without appearing to surrender. By the end of the first decade of the war, circumstances began to shift. The death of Emperor Joseph I in 1711 elevated Archduke Charles II, Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. This development altered the strategic landscape. If Charles were to inherit both the Austrian Habsburg lands in Spain, the resulting concentration of power might alarm his own allies. England and the Dutch Republic, originally committed to preventing Bourbon dominance, now feared the possibility of an overwhelming Habsburg Empire. These changing dynamics complicated the conflict further. Alliances that had once seemed stable now required reassessment. Negotiations gained urgency as war fatigue spread across Europe. Resources were depleted, and populations grew weary of prolonged conflict. Though fighting continued, the desire for a settlement strengthened. Throughout the confrontation, one reality became clear. The war had passed the point where a simple resolution could restore the previous balance. Too many lives had been lost, too many territories contested, and too many alliances reached. The rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons had transformed into a broader struggle that redefined Europe's political structure. Even before the war concluded, its consequences were already reshaping identities and expectations. For the Habsburgs, the conflict represented both a defense of their legacy and a test of their endurance. They fought to maintain their claim to Spain and to preserve their standing as a leading dynasty. Yet each year of war also revealed the limits of their influence. For the Bourbons, the confrontation affirmed their determination to secure Spain for their line, even at great cost. Both sides recognized that whatever the outcome, Europe would not return to its previous state. The war's confrontation phase thus marked a peak of tension and effort. Armies clashed across regions, diplomats negotiated between campaigns, monarchs weighed decisions that could shape their dynasties' futures. The struggle had become more than a dispute over inheritance. It was a test of resilience, legitimacy, and the ability of rival houses to shape the continent according to their vision. As the conflict continued, the question shifted from who could win outright to what kind of peace might be possible. Yet one thing was certain. The war had already crossed a threshold from which there could be no easy return. The alliances formed, the battles fought, and the sacrifices made had altered the political landscape irreversibly. Even before the final treaties were signed, Europe had entered a new era, one forged in the confrontation between dynasties determined to secure their place in history. By the second decade of the 18th century, Europe was exhausted. Years of marching armies, shifting alliances, and costly battles had drained treasuries and strained populations. What began as a dynastic dispute over Spain's throne had evolved into a continental war that reshaped borders, alliances, and identities. Though neither side had achieved total victory, both recognized that the conflict could not continue indefinitely. The question was no longer how to win, but how to end a war that had already changed Europe beyond recognition. Negotiations that led to peace were complex and cautious. Representatives from multiple powers gathered to draft agreements that would preserve balance without granting overwhelming dominance to any single dynasty. The result was a series of treaties, most notably the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, followed by additional agreements in Rastut and Bodden. Together, they brought the War of the Spanish Succession to an end and established a new political order. The settlement confirmed Philip of Anjou as Philip V of Spain, securing the Bourbon claim to the Spanish throne. However, strict conditions were imposed to prevent the crowns of France and Spain from ever uniting under one ruler. This clause aimed to maintain the balance of power that had motivated much of the conflict. For the Habsburgs, the outcome was both a loss and a consolation. They did not regain Spain, but they received significant territories in Europe, including the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and parts of Italy. These acquisitions strengthened their presence in Central and Southern Europe. Though they could not fully replace the influence that Spain had once provided, the immediate aftermath of the war brought relief across the continent. Armies began to demobilize. Trade routes reopened. Cities and towns damaged by years of conflict slowly began to rebuild. Yet the peace was not without tension. Each power assessed the outcome in terms of gains and losses, calculating how the new arrangements affected their long-term interests. Though the war had ended, its consequences would continue to shape European politics for decades. For the Habsburg dynasty, the loss of Spain marked a turning point. For generations, Spain had been a central pillar of their influence. Its vast territories, wealth from overseas colonies, and strategic position had contributed significantly to their authority. Without it, their role in European politics changed. They remained powerful, particularly in Central Europe, but their reach was reduced. The division between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family, already established decades earlier, now became permanent. The Spanish line, under Bourbon rule, moved in a different direction. This shift affected the Habsburgs' sense of identity. Their strategy of expansion through marriage had once united multiple realms under a single dynastic network. Now that network had fractured. The Austrian branch continued to rule extensive territories, but the dream of a vast, interconnected empire spanning Spain and Central Europe had ended. They were forced to adapt, focusing more on consolidating their influence within the Holy Roman Empire and neighboring regions. The human costs of the war also became more apparent in its aftermath. Soldiers returned home with injuries, both visible and unseen. Families mourned those who did not return. Regions that had served as battlegrounds faced economic hardship and population decline. While treaties settled political disputes, they could not undo the suffering experienced by those who lived through the conflict. The war had been fought in the name of dynastic legitimacy, yet its consequences reached far beyond royal courts. Within the Habsburg family, the outcome prompted reflection. They had defended their claim to Spain with determination, yet the final settlement required them to accept a new reality. Their authority now rested primarily on their Austrian and Central European holdings. This shift encouraged a renewed focus on internal stability and governance. Future rulers would need to strengthen their remaining territories and maintain alliances carefully to preserve their position in a changing Europe. For the Bourbons, securing Spain represented a major achievement. Philip V's reign marked the beginning of a new chapter in Spanish history. However, the conditions of the peace limited the extent to which France and Spain could cooperate. The prohibition against uniting their crowns ensured that the balance of power remained intact. France retained influence, but not absolute dominance. The war's outcome thus reflected a compromise shaped by mutual exhaustion and shared interest in stability. The broader European landscape also changed. England emerged from the conflict with increased naval and commercial influence, securing strategic territories such as Gibraltar and Minorca. The Dutch Republic preserved its independence and trade networks. Smaller states adjusted to the new balance, recognizing that no single power could dominate without facing opposition. The concept of maintaining equilibrium among major powers became a guiding principle in European diplomacy. For the Habsburgs, the aftermath of the war included a gradual shift in focus. Without Spain, they concentrated more on their Central European lands and the Holy Roman Empire. Vienna became an even more important center of governance and culture. Efforts were made to strengthen administrative structures, improve military organization, and reinforce alliances. Though they had lost one part of their empire, they remained determined to preserve what remained and to adapt to the new political environment. The long-term impact of the war extended beyond territorial changes. It influenced how dynasties viewed succession, alliance, and legitimacy. The conflict demonstrated that inheritance alone could not determine political outcomes. International acceptance and balance of power considerations played equally important roles. For the Habsburgs, this realization underscored the importance of diplomacy alongside dynastic strategy. Yet even as the dynasty adjusted to its altered circumstances, the consequences of its earlier practices remained. The reliance on closely related marriages had contributed to the fragility of the Spanish line. The death of Charles II without an heir had triggered the very crisis that led to war. Though the Austrian branch continued, concerns about succession and stability persisted. The need to produce healthy heirs and maintain alliances remained central to their future. In the years following the treaties, Europe entered a period of relative stability. Trade resumed, and cultural exchanges flourished. Yet the memory of the war lingered. It served as a reminder of how quickly disputes over inheritance could escalate into widespread conflict. For the Habsburgs and their rivals, the lessons of the war influenced future decisions about marriage, alliance, and governance. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession thus marked more than the conclusion of a military conflict. It represented a redefinition of power in Europe. The Habsburgs remained influential, but no longer dominated Spain. The Bourbons secured a major victory but accepted limitations on their expansion. Other powers gained advantages that strengthened their positions. The balance that emerged reflected a complex interplay of ambition, compromise, and necessity. For individuals within the Habsburg dynasty, the aftermath brought both relief and uncertainty. The immediate threat of war had passed, but the loss of Spain altered their role in European affairs. They faced the challenge of maintaining relevance in a political landscape shaped by new alliances and shifting priorities. Their legacy as a dynasty that had once ruled vast territories remained, yet it now carried the weight of adaptation. In the decades that followed, the Habsburgs would continue to play a central role in European politics, particularly through their Austrian branch. They would face new challenges, including succession, disputes, wars, and the pressures of changing political ideas. The consequences of the War of the Spanish Succession would shape their decisions and influence their strategies. Though they had not emerged from the conflict as complete victors, they had survived, and survival itself required resilience and adjustment. The aftermath of the war thus left a lasting imprint on Europe and on the Habsburg dynasty. It demonstrated the limits of dynastic ambition and the importance of balance among powers. It revealed the human cost of political rivalry and the enduring impact of decisions made in royal courts. For the Habsburgs, it marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, a period in which they would seek to preserve their legacy while navigating a world transformed by conflict. The war had reached its conclusion, but its consequences would continue to echo through the lives of rulers and subjects alike. The dynasty that had once ruled vast territories across Europe now faced the task of redefining its place in a new order. What they had lost could not be fully regained. What they retained would require careful stewardship, and the lessons of the conflict would remain with them, shaping their path forward as they moved into the next chapter of their history. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession did not bring an end to the Habsburg story. It brought a moment of reckoning. The dynasty had survived one of the greatest crises in its history, but survival carried a different meaning now. The vast, interconnected empire that once stretched from Madrid to Vienna had fractured. Spain was gone. The Habsburgs remained powerful, yet their identity as Europe's unchallenged ruling house had been permanently altered. What followed was not immediate collapse, but a quieter struggle, one fought within palaces, councils, and the minds of those tasked with preserving the family's legacy. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs turned inward, seeking stability after decades of war. Emperor Charles VI, who had once fought to claim Spain, now ruled a more compact, but still significant collection of territories. He understood that the dynasty's future depended on maintaining cohesion and ensuring a clear line of succession. Yet this proved more difficult than expected. The problem that had plagued the Spanish branch, the uncertainty of heirs, began to echo within the Austrian line as well. Charles VI had no surviving sons. His determination to secure his daughter Maria Theresa's right to inherit became the focus of his later reign. In 1713, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a decree intended to ensure that his lands could pass intact to a female heir. He spent years persuading European powers to recognize this arrangement. Diplomats traveled across courts, securing promises of support. On paper, the future seemed safeguarded. In reality, those promises rested on fragile foundations. When Charles VI died in 1740, Maria Theresa inherited a complex and vulnerable empire. Despite earlier assurances, several European powers challenged her claim. The War of the Austrian Succession erupted, demonstrating how quickly alliances could shift when opportunity appeared. Maria Theresa, young and determined, found herself defending not only her right to rule, but the survival of the Habsburg dynasty itself. Her reign would become one of resilience and reform, yet it began under the shadow of uncertainty. These conflicts were not merely political. They represented a deeper struggle over identity. The Habsburgs had long defined themselves through continuity, the idea that their rule was ordained by tradition and reinforced by inheritance. Yet each succession crisis forced them to confront the reality that power depended as much on acceptance as on lineage. Maria Theresa's fight to secure her position illustrated this truth. She rallied support, reorganized her administration, and strengthened her armies. In doing so, she preserved the dynasty's authority, though not without costs. The internal reflections of the Habsburg family during this period were shaped by loss and adaptation. They had once relied heavily on marriage alliances to secure territories and influence. Now, they needed to balance that strategy with practical governance and reform. The empire they governed included diverse regions with different languages, laws, and traditions. Maintaining unity required careful management and, increasingly, compromise. Within the royal household, expectations remained high. Members of the dynasty were raised with a strong sense of duty. Their lives were structured around the needs of the state. Personal desires were often set aside for political necessity. This pattern had long been part of Habsburg life, yet the experiences of recent decades made its costs more visible. The pressure to maintain continuity and legitimacy weighed heavily on each generation. Even as they adapted to new circumstances, the burden of representing a centuries-old dynasty remained. Externally, the Habsburgs continued to face challenges from rival powers. Prussia emerged as a formidable force under Frederick the Great, contesting Austrian influence in Central Europe. France remained a competitor in diplomatic and military affairs. The Ottoman Empire still posed a threat in the East. Each conflict required resources and attention. Each demanded careful decision-making to preserve stability. Yet the Habsburgs also achieved moments of renewal. Under Maria Theresa and her successors, reforms were introduced to strengthen administration, education, and the military. Vienna became a center of culture and intellectual life. Music, art, and architecture flourished. These developments helped reinforce the dynasty's prestige even as its political landscape changed. The Habsburgs learned to present themselves not only as rulers by inheritance, but as stewards of a complex, evolving empire. Still, reflection lingered beneath the surface. The loss of Spain had demonstrated that even long-standing dynasties could face irreversible change. The wars of succession had revealed the fragility of alliances and the unpredictability of inheritance. The dynasty that once seemed unassailable had been forced to adapt repeatedly. Its survival depended on resilience and the ability to learn from past crises. As the 18th century progressed, the Habsburgs remained central to European affairs, yet their role had shifted. They were no longer the sole dominant power. Instead, they became one of several major players in a balance of competing interests. This new reality required them to reconsider how they defined success. Survival, stability, and adaptability became as important as expansion. The final battles of this period were not only fought on fields, but within institutions and identities. Each reform, each diplomatic decision, and each succession plan reflected an effort to secure the dynasty's future. The Habsburgs had endured loss and conflict, yet they continued to shape the political and cultural landscape of Europe. Their story in this era was one of persistence, a determination to maintain continuity even as circumstances forced them to evolve. In the quiet halls of their palaces, portraits of past rulers still hung as reminders of earlier triumphs. Yet those images now carried a different meaning. They represented not only the height of Habsburg power, but also the cost of maintaining it. The dynasty's reflection on its own history became part of its identity. It had survived wars, rivalries, and internal challenges, but survival required acknowledging that the world around them had changed, and that their place within it would never again be quite the same. Empires do not vanish all at once. Even after power shifts, after wars end, and after territories are lost, the symbols of authority remain. For the Habsburgs, legacy did not exist only in treaties or bloodlines. It lived in palaces, rituals, portraits, and traditions that continued long after the height of their power had passed. These physical and cultural monuments became the dynasty's way of shaping memory, a reminder to Europe that though their influence had changed, their presence had not disappeared. In Vienna, the heart of Habsburg authority after the loss of Spain, architecture became a language of endurance. The Hofburg Palace expanded across centuries, its wings and courtyards reflecting the gradual evolution of the dynasty itself. Each edition spoke of continuity. Emperors and empresses lived, governed, and held court within its walls, surrounded by symbols of inherited legitimacy. Visitors walking through its halls encountered portraits of rulers stretching back generations, their faces forming a visual narrative of dynastic persistence. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of Habsburg identity emerged in Schönbrunn Palace. Originally conceived as a hunting lodge, it grew into a vast summer residence under Maria Theresa. Its yellow facade and sweeping gardens conveyed both grandeur and stability. Here, the dynasty presented itself as refined and cultivated, patrons of music, art, and learning. Concerts echoed through its halls. Diplomats gathered beneath its ceilings. The palace embodied the idea that even after political setbacks, cultural influence could reinforce authority. Yet these monuments did more than project strength. They also masked private realities. Behind ceremonial rooms and carefully arranged gardens, the dynasty faced ongoing challenges. Maintaining such estates required resources and careful management. The splendor presented to visitors was often a deliberate effort to sustain the image of an unbroken, confident house. Public memory and private truth did not always align. The palaces suggested permanence. The realities of politics suggested adaptation. Symbols extended beyond buildings. The Habsburg coat of arms, with its double-headed eagle, remained a powerful emblem of continuity. It appeared on official documents, banners, and ceremonial regalia. Each display reinforced the idea that the dynasty still held a central place in European affairs. Titles and honors granted by Habsburg rulers carried weight across courts, even as their territorial reach shifted. Their symbolic authority endured. Cultural patronage became another avenue for shaping legacy. The Habsburg court supported composers, artists, and scholars, helping Vienna develop into a major center of European culture. Music by composers such as Mozart and Haydn flourished under Habsburg patronage. Operas, symphonies, and theatrical performances filled court calendars. These cultural achievements contributed to a reputation that extended beyond political power. They allowed the dynasty to maintain influence through prestige and artistic leadership. Religious and ceremonial traditions also reinforced continuity. Coronations, processions, and public celebrations followed carefully preserved rituals. Each event linked the present to the past, reminding subjects and observers of the dynasty's long-standing role. Even as political structures evolved, these ceremonies offered a sense of stability. They reassured populations that authority remained grounded in tradition. Yet the enduring moments of Habsburg history were not limited to displays of splendor. They included quieter achievements and adaptations. Under Maria Theresa and her successors, administrative reforms improved governance across their territories. Educational initiatives expanded opportunities for learning. Legal systems were standardized. These measures helped maintain cohesion within a diverse empire. They demonstrated that the dynasty's legacy rested not only on inherited power but on the ability to govern effectively. The family's influence also spread through marriage into other royal houses, though the practice of closely related marriages had earlier contributed to difficulties. Broader alliances connected the Habsburg line with numerous European dynasties. These connections ensured that even as direct control over certain territories ended, the family's presence continued in various courts. Their bloodline remained intertwined with the continent's ruling houses, reinforcing the idea that their legacy extended beyond specific borders. Public memory of the Habsburgs often emphasized grandeur and tradition. Visitors to Vienna marveled at its palaces and ceremonies. Artists depicted the dynasty in idealized portraits. Writers described court life with fascination. Yet, within the family, memory carried additional layers. The loss of Spain and the challenges of succession remained part of their collective experience. Each new generation inherited not only titles and lands but also the lessons of past conflicts. One enduring moment that symbolized both continuity and change came in the 19th century, when the Habsburg Empire transformed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This arrangement recognized the diversity of the lands under Habsburg rule while attempting to maintain unity. It demonstrated the dynasty's willingness to adapt to changing political realities. Though the empire faced internal tensions, it persisted for decades, reflecting the family's capacity to evolve. At the same time, symbols of legacy took on new meanings. Palaces became museums as well as residences. Ceremonies became both tradition and performance. The dynasty's story began to shift from one of expansion to one of preservation. Their monuments served as reminders of past influence, even as their political role changed. They became custodians of a historical narrative that continued to shape European identity. Public perception often focused on the visible aspects of Habsburg life: the architecture, the music, the pageantry. Yet beneath these symbols lay the private experiences of those who lived within the dynasty. Members of the family navigated expectations shaped by centuries of tradition. They were raised with an awareness of their role in maintaining continuity. Their personal lives were often shaped by duty rather than preference. The cost of sustaining legacy could be measured not only in lost territories, but in constrained choices. Even in moments of celebration, a sense of reflection remained. Portraits of earlier rulers reminded later generations of both triumph and challenge. Ceremonial halls echoed with history. The symbols surrounding them carried weight. They represented achievements that had defined Europe and decisions that had reshaped it. The dynasty's enduring moments thus existed on multiple levels: public and private, visible and unspoken. As the centuries progressed, the Habsburg legacy continued to influence European culture and memory. Their palaces became historical landmarks. Their patronage of the arts left lasting contributions. Their role in shaping political structures remained part of historical narratives. Even after their political power declined, their symbols endured as reminders of a dynasty that had once ruled vast territories and shaped the continent's destiny. The monuments and traditions associated with the Habsburgs illustrate how legacy extends beyond immediate power. They demonstrate that influence can persist through culture, architecture, and memory. For the dynasty, these symbols offered continuity even as circumstances changed. They allowed them to present a narrative of endurance and adaptation. Yet every monument also carried an unspoken acknowledgement of cost. Behind each palace and ceremony lay decisions that had shaped the family's trajectory, choices about marriage, alliance, and governance. The splendor of their legacy coexisted with the consequences of those choices. The symbols that endured across generations reflected both achievement and sacrifice. In the end, the Habsburgs' monuments and traditions formed a bridge between past and present. They reminded Europe of a dynasty that had risen from modest beginnings to dominate vast regions, and that had adapted when circumstances shifted. Their legacy lived not only in the territories they once ruled, but in the cultural and historical landscape they helped create. Through architecture, ceremony, and memory, the Habsburgs ensured that even as their political power evolved, their story would remain woven into the fabric of European history. By the 19th century, the Habsburg dynasty still stood at the center of European politics. Yet the nature of its power had begun to shift. The world that had once allowed dynasties to rule vast territories through inheritance and alliance was changing. New ideas about nationhood, governance, and identity were spreading across the continent. The Habsburgs, long accustomed to maintaining authority through tradition and family networks, now faced challenges that could not be solved through marriage or ceremony alone. The transformation did not occur overnight. For decades, the dynasty continued to govern a diverse empire that included Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Italians, and many others. Managing such diversity required careful balance. The Habsburg rulers relied on a combination of administrative reform, military strength, and diplomatic negotiation to maintain unity. Yet beneath the surface, tensions grew. Different regions sought greater autonomy. National movements gained momentum. The idea that a single dynasty could represent so many distinct identities became increasingly difficult to sustain. The 19th century brought a series of revolutions and political upheavals across Europe. In 1848, uprisings spread through many of the Habsburg lands. Protesters demanded constitutional reforms, national recognition, and greater participation in government. For a moment, it seemed as though the dynasty might lose control entirely. Though the revolutions were eventually suppressed, they revealed the depth of dissatisfaction within the empire. The Habsburgs retained their authority, but they could no longer ignore the forces reshaping Europe. One of the dynasty's responses to these pressures was the creation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867. This arrangement granted Hungary significant autonomy while preserving the Habsburg monarch as emperor and king. It represented an attempt to adapt to new political realities by sharing power rather than concentrating it. For a time, this compromise stabilized the empire. Vienna and Budapest became dual centers of authority, and the monarchy continued to function as a unifying symbol. Yet even this adaptation could not fully resolve underlying tensions. National movements continued to grow among other groups within the empire. Economic changes, industrialization, and the spread of new political ideas further complicated governance. The Habsburgs remained influential, but their ability to control events diminished. Their authority now depended as much on negotiation and compromise as on inherited legitimacy. The final blow to the dynasty's political dominance came in the early 20th century. On 28 June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo. His death triggered a chain of events that led to the First World War. The conflict engulfed Europe and extended far beyond its borders. For the Habsburg Empire, the war proved catastrophic. Military losses, economic strain, and internal divisions weakened the state beyond repair. By 1918, after 4 years of war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. National movements declared independence. New states emerged from former imperial territories. Emperor Charles I, the last Habsburg ruler, relinquished participation in government, effectively ending centuries of dynastic rule. The family that had once governed vast regions across Europe no longer held political power. Their palaces remained. Their titles endured in memory, but their authority had passed into history. The decline of the Habsburg dynasty did not erase its legacy. Cultural contributions, architectural achievements, and historical influence remained visible across Europe. Vienna continued to be a center of art and music. Palaces such as Schönbrunn and the Hofburg became symbols of a bygone era. Yet the end of political rule marked a profound transformation. The dynasty that had once relied on continuity and inheritance to maintain power now existed primarily as a historical presence. For members of the Habsburg family, the transition required adjustment. Some entered private life. Others remained active in cultural or charitable roles. Their identity shifted from ruling dynasty to historical lineage. The expectations that had once defined their lives changed. Without an empire to govern, they faced the challenge of redefining their place in a modern world shaped by republics and nations. The decline of the Habsburgs illustrates the limits of dynastic power in an era of change. Their strategy of maintaining influence through marriage and inheritance had served them well for centuries. It allowed them to expand their reach and secure alliances across Europe. Yet the same reliance on tradition made adaptation more difficult when political structures evolved. As new ideas about governance and identity emerged, the foundations of dynastic rule weakened. The fall of the Habsburg political order also highlighted the human cost of maintaining such a vast empire. Generations of rulers had dedicated their lives to preserving continuity. Their personal choices were often shaped by duty rather than preference. The pressure to maintain alliances and produce heirs influenced their relationships and experiences. The end of the dynasty's rule brought relief for some and uncertainty for others. It marked the close of a chapter defined by ambition, resilience, and sacrifice. Looking back, the Habsburgs' final outcome can be seen as both an ending and a transformation. Their political authority ended in 1918, but their influence did not vanish entirely. Their legacy remained embedded in European culture, architecture, and history. The institutions they shaped continued to evolve. The cities they developed retained traces of their presence. The story of their rise and decline became part of the broader narrative of Europe itself. The dynasty that had once ruled vast territories through careful alliances and determined ambition ultimately faced forces beyond its control. Nationalism, modern governance, and global conflict reshaped the world in ways that dynastic strategies could not counter. The Habsburgs adapted where they could and endured for centuries, yet their era of direct rule came to a close. Their decline serves as a reminder that even the most powerful families must confront change. Authority built on tradition can last for generations, but it must evolve to survive. The Habsburgs' story reflects both the strength of continuity and the challenges of adaptation. They left behind monuments, cultural achievements, and a complex legacy that continues to influence how history remembers them. The final outcome of their dynasty was not a sudden disappearance, but a gradual transformation. From rulers of empires to figures of history, they moved from the center of political power to the realm of legacy. Their story, shaped by ambition, alliance, and endurance, remains one of the most compelling in European history, a testament to how power can rise, adapt, and eventually yield to the forces of change. For centuries, the Habsburgs believed that power could be secured through continuity, through marriage, inheritance, and an unbroken chain of blood. They rose from modest origins to rule vast territories across Europe and beyond. Their banners flew over kingdoms, their relatives occupied thrones, and their decisions shaped the course of history. Few families achieved such reach, and fewer still maintained it for so long. Yet the very methods that built their empire carried hidden costs. Marriages arranged for stability narrowed personal choices and, over time, narrowed the family itself. The pressure to preserve a dynasty placed immense burdens on those born into it. Kings and queens were expected to embody continuity rather than individuality. Their lives became symbols of legacy, their relationships shaped by necessity rather than affection. What was gained in power was often lost in personal freedom. The rivalry that defined much of their history, particularly the struggle over Spain, revealed how fragile even the greatest dynasties could be. The loss of Spain marked a turning point. Though the Habsburgs endured and adapted, the dream of a unified, far-reaching empire could not be fully restored. Later generations fought to preserve what remained, balancing reform with tradition, resilience with reflection. They succeeded in surviving for centuries more. Yet each success carried the memory of what had already been lost. In the end, the dynasty did not vanish in a single moment. It faded through a series of transformations. Wars reshaped borders. National movements redefined loyalty. The First World War brought a final end to their political rule. What remained were the monuments, the music, the architecture, and the stories. Reminders of a family that once held extraordinary influence and paid a profound price for maintaining it. The Habsburgs gained power through strategy, patience, and determination. They secured alliances, ruled diverse lands, and left an enduring cultural legacy. But the cost of that power was measured in more than lost territories. It was measured in constrained lives, in the weight of expectation carried across generations, and in the gradual realization that legacy and stability could not always coexist without sacrifice. Their story leaves a quiet question behind. What does it mean to win if survival demands so much of those who carry the crown? The Habsburgs preserved their name and shaped history. Yet in doing so, they revealed that even the greatest victories leave marks that cannot be undone. Their rise was remarkable. Their endurance was extraordinary. And their decline reminds us that power, no matter how carefully maintained, always carries a cost that time eventually reveals.